All right, so welcome, folks. We're just getting started here, so welcome on. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're here with Olena Lennon, who is very generous with her time and willing to educate us all last spring as the war in Ukraine was first breaking news. And now a year has passed and a lot of people are maybe not able to keep up as much as they had before. And so we're really grateful to have her here again tonight to sort of go over a retrospective of what's happened since. So I just wanted to let everyone know the way this will be structured is that Olena will talk for a half hour and lecture and kind of give us the situation in the war since. And then the last half hour will be open for questions. You're free to type them along as we go, and I'll moderate and keep note of those questions. And so I wanted to introduce you all to Olena Lennon, Ph.D., as a practitioner in residence in the National Security Department at the University of New Haven, where she teaches such courses as the U.S. Foreign and Defense Policy and International Relations. Formerly a Fulbright scholar from Ukraine and most recently a scholar at Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., she has dedicated her research to the study of conflict management and identity politics in Eastern Europe, focused on domestic and foreign policy of Ukraine. An Eastern Ukraine native, Dr. Lennon has been a regular participant in scholarly and media forums related to issues in Ukraine, facilitating a more informed and objective analysis of the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war. She also serves as an election observer with Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and has completed several election observation missions in the region. And again, Olena, thank you for joining us tonight and keeping us all informed. We really appreciate your being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Ari, for that wonderful and generous introduction. Thank you, everybody, for attending this Zoom talk, especially if you're coming back the third time. So I really appreciate you paying attention to the issue. And I wish the circumstances would have been different for us to reconvene and talk about Ukraine again. Of course, I personally wish that the times would have been more celebratory, but we're getting there, and that's going to be a big part of my talk, is hopefully share some optimism with you, as while also providing a realistic overview of what had happened in the last year. So what I'm going to do in the next maybe half hour is just give you my view of the situation and also lessons that we have learned. I'm sure that you have all been following events during the past year. Things have been very dynamic, and this has been a brutal, grinding war with many turning points, defeats and victories on both sides. Obviously massive casualties and just absolutely catastrophic for the entire world. So instead of focusing on some of those events, what I thought I would do was spend most of my time trying to provide a little bit of an analysis as far as what we have learned, and also, where do we go from here? What we have learned as and here in the West in particular, but also what it has meant for regional security and for global security. Now, as you may remember, or if not, the war actually started 9 years ago. So as we're marking 1 year of the reinvasion or the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, I think it's also important to keep in mind that we're coming up on, we just actually marked 9 years since the war started in 2014, when Russia invaded, annexed Crimea, and also occupied parts of Eastern Ukraine, where I'm from. So with that, I just wanted to caveat that, I'm speaking to you as an American Ukrainian, somebody who teaches American foreign policy and who is also, while a lot of my friends and family are in Ukraine, I'm a concerned American citizen. And I wanted to emphasize, some of the lessons and implications of this war for Americans, because I recognize that we have to keep our priorities in mind as well, as much as we all wish for the quickest resolution of the war in Ukraine. All right. So what I want to do first is just give you a very brief recap as far as where things are now, So as we speak, one of the most gruesome battles is ongoing in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region, in the town of Bakhmut, where the Ukrainian and Russian forces are fighting for the control of this, small town, but it's critical in terms of its tactical and strategic significance because it's a major transportation hub. But it's also the town of Bakhmut in the east also presents value in terms of providing Russia, if they were to capture it, access to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk that would kind of complete their control of the Donbas region as they had been trying to establish. But I want to kind of remind everybody that when the war started a year ago, Russia had maximalist aims. On February 24th, 2014, the war started with multi-pronged attacks all around Ukraine and in several regions of Ukraine, with the goal of decapitating the regime in Kiev. And one of the key turning points in this war was that about a month after the invasion, the Kiev offensive was successfully repelled by the Ukrainian forces, much to the Russian surprise, and also, to the surprise of many, really, in Western communities. But what was particularly significant about the liberation of the Kiev region was not only the fact that, Putin's objectives became obvious to the entire world community, that the goal was never to control just eastern Ukraine. The political aim of that invasion was to subjugate the entire Ukraine. So this was not about eastern or western Ukraine, Russian-speaking or Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians. This was about changing regimes in Ukraine. This was about removing Zelensky from his post and installing a pro-Russian proxy regime that would change its orientation toward away from pro-EU, pro-NATO, and back into Russia's sphere of influence. But one very significant development of the Kiev counteroffensive that repelled the Russians, or pushed back the Russians by several miles outside that region to the Belarusian border and elsewhere, was that after Kiev, Bucha, Irpin, and other towns around Kiev were liberated, massive war crimes were revealed. And I think at that point, European countries and other concerned partners of Ukraine or supporters of Ukraine were truly appalled by just the sheer brutality of this offensive and the war crimes revealed during the very short occupation of towns outside Kiev that really showed true colors of what kind of a military we're dealing with. The Russian military showed completely no regard for laws of war, if you will, rules of engagement. Civilians were targeted and executed summary style, massive systemic torture, rape, execution of civilians, particularly men. So what that particular what liberation of Kiev showed was that this war was genocidal in nature, because it didn't just target the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian political system. It targeted Ukrainians, civilians, and civilians were targeted in places of residence, and the Russian army would go door to door looking for people who could, who were perceived as collaborators with the Ukrainian regime, granted that they were actually Ukrainian citizens in Ukraine. So another turning point during the year was the liberation of the Kharkiv region, that marked in blue there on the map, which was another successful counteroffensive that pushed the Russians back. And then finally, liberation of Kherson. Since then, since November, really, there has been very minimal gain or movement on the battlefield, and this has really become a grinding war of attrition. It is estimated that the Russians are actually losing anywhere from 800 soldiers a day in this artillery fight in Bakhmut. It is, it is an artillery duel, which brings minimal gain to both sides. But it's critical to both Ukraine and Russia to hold on to Bakhmut as the center of the defensive lines. So what I want to sort of emphasize was, in terms of where the war is at now, is that both Ukraine and Russia believe that the war is still winnable. So, as a matter of fact, there are two things that both the Russian forces or the Russian political regime, political leadership, and Ukrainians believe is: number one, is that victory is still possible, therefore, grinding war of attrition, and number two, defeat is unacceptable. With those two irreconcilable goals, really, we're dealing with a brutal, exhaustive battles that have caused tremendous casualties on both sides. Now, I want to point out too that when we talk about the Kyiv offensive and the initial invasion of Ukraine, I think one thing that is really important to keep in mind, that the significance of liberation of that counteroffensive in the opening phases of the war, is that the Russian troops were as close as about 9 miles to where Zelensky was. So even though as they were closing in, around from the suburbs, closing in on the center of Kyiv, the capital, they came really close. And this was, even though they didn't establish air dominance, but, this was a brutal tank campaign and with heavy use of artillery and missile strikes that the Ukrainians successfully repelled. But this was a very, very dangerous moment in the war, where the willpower and the effectiveness with which the Ukrainians have fought back really set the tone for the remainder of this war effort. Obviously, there's massive casualties on both sides, particularly among civilians. The Ukrainians do not disclose. They wouldn't really know the exact military casualties, but it is estimated that on the Russian side, so far about 65,000 Russian soldiers have already been killed in the war, and that's more than all Russian and Soviet wars combined. So this is, the Russians have paid a very high price, but Putin is not backing down. So another major event that was a result of this brutal war was massive displacement of the Ukrainian population, was about 7 million refugees overseas, and about a quarter of the population displaced inside Ukraine. Now, obviously, the war has also had global implications. It has upended energy and food security in the world. It's important to keep in mind that both Russia and Ukraine combined make up for about 40% of the world's wheat export. Obviously, when those exports were compromised due to military activity in Ukraine and due to sanctions on Russia's side, that sent shockwaves around the world, particularly in the so-called global South, in Middle East and Africa, that relied on inexpensive wheat exports from Ukraine and Russia. But one of the, where the war took a different turn was particularly in last October, in October of 2022, after Ukraine had, successfully liberated, huge chunks of territory that it took Russia 6 months to occupy. A new phase of the war began with indiscriminate airstrikes, missile, artillery shells, and also Iranian-made drones to target not just military infrastructure, but civilians, particularly energy infrastructure. Now, this was intentional because as Russia's kind of calculus in that case was to put pressure on the Zelensky government and also on the Ukrainian civilians going into the winter, expecting that by targeting power supplies and by targeting power facilities, the Russians really expected that Ukrainian morale and will to fight would break, that it would create more refugee outflows to Europe, it would destabilize Europe, it would put pressure on European governments, it would also demoralize Ukrainians. And so these strikes on civilian energy infrastructure were indiscriminate, brutal, and targeted most vulnerable populations. Another kind of turning point in the war was just the accumulation of war crimes of every kind there is. It might be a different kind of conversation, but so far already the Prosecutor General of Ukraine has 70,000 documented war crimes on their desk, ranging from crimes against humanity, genocide, and obviously the crime of all crimes is crime of aggression. That is the hardest to prosecute. But one of the things that I wanted to emphasize that has made this war different and the brutality of this war particularly gruesome was the genocidal nature of the war manifested itself in forceful transfers of children, orphaned children from war zones, particularly from Eastern Ukraine to Russia, and instituting forceful adoption of Ukrainian children. Yale School of Public Health has recently put out a report where they used satellites to identify several dozen re-education centers in Russia-controlled territories that transferred about 6,000 Ukrainian children that have been moved to Russia to be adopted into Russian families. Their names were changed. Now, this is a blatant violation of international law. It's basically genocide, changing the ethnic makeup of a population, particularly among children of the opposing side in the middle of the war, is a gruesome violation. Now, as far as why the war has been so brutal, and why Russia failed to achieve its objectives, I want to emphasize a few reasons why Russia had resorted to such brutal tactics, and why Russia's performance has been so miserable and requiring Putin to scale down his objectives. So first of all, the one fundamental strategic mistake that Putin has made is that he, as a leader, he failed to match his political objectives with his capabilities, resulting in his military not being able to deliver on his maximalist political aims that were rooted in Putin's own delusions and hubris, born out of historical revisionism and then colonialism. So the special operation aimed to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine was sort of not only maximalist in its objectives, but also just fundamentally flawed in its understanding of history, in its understanding of Ukraine as its own nation and as its own state. Now, the second reason Russia has failed so miserably was because Putin really had, we suspect that Putin had really bad intelligence, that we're not sure how curated his intelligence is, but it seemed as though he really overestimated his own military capabilities, and in combination with flawed intelligence, he miscalculated his military's ability to not only, invade a country and capture terrain, but also hold terrain. And one of the main reasons why Russia failed to hold occupied territories was because there was absolutely no buy-in among local populations. So what they expected to see was, Russian-speaking Ukrainians embracing the Russian military as liberators, That's what the Russian soldiers were told, but that's not what they saw. So they were very disappointed to find that Ukrainians were not welcoming of the Russians. In fact, they fought them actively. There's resistance movements, underground movements, territorial defense forces, regardless of whether they were Russian or Ukrainian speaking or how they felt about Russia. The rise of civil resistance in Ukraine was not something that Putin calculated correctly. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly talk about what helped Ukraine achieve, or not only push the Russians back or hold the defensive line, but actually mount several successful counteroffensives to where Ukrainians are now no longer outmanned and outgunned. They actually have a slight quantitative advantage, and they definitely have qualitative advantage given the supply of weapons from Ukraine. But the number one, I think the main reason the Ukrainians have done so well is because of the motivation, morale, and sense of unity and patriotism among its troops, and also in the sort of among civilians as well. Right now, Ukraine actually avoided a second wave of mobilization because they have enough reserves. People have actually, in the opening phases of the war, military recruitment offices actually had to turn people away. So many people, young people of various ages, wanted to enlist in the armed forces and fight, that they actually had to turn people away. And it's not what Putin had expected, obviously. He expected Ukrainians to be running away and surrendering to Russia, but that's not at all what happened. Now, in terms of what's the potential for the diplomatic resolution, or where the war is headed, right now the talk of any negotiations is completely off the table. There's no appetite for negotiations or concessions at all, especially after the revelation of massive war crimes. The Ukrainians have no illusions about what living under the Russian control will look like because of the genocidal nature of the war. But the reason there is no momentum for negotiations is because both Russia and Ukraine currently believe that they can still achieve their minimal objectives. And so here are some of the reasons why. So first of all, after suffering massive defeats on the battlefield, Putin finally resorted to what everybody perceived as a political risk, but he actually instituted partial mobilization. And even though these are not the best trained forces, but this partial mobilization consisting mostly of former prisoners and convicts, but it still helped Russia stabilize Russian lines and reduce the length of the front line, because what the battles that we're seeing in Bakhmut right now are a result of this partial mobilization, where this Wagner group, the private military contractors, are the frontline soldiers that are being basically used as cannon fodder. Now, the Russians are also leveraging airstrikes against civilian infrastructure. Just yesterday, there was one of the largest airstrike campaigns across the entire Ukraine, targeting particularly power infrastructure. Now, those are punitive attacks, and that's Russia basically signaling that they want to break morale, and they want Ukraine to withdraw, to retreat from Bakhmut, to allow Russia to kind of claim that victory. Now, another game changer for Russia was the support of Iran. That's not something we saw until about middle of last year, when now those cheap capabilities, those drones and missiles from Iran, really unfortunately kind of expanded Russia's capabilities and are seen to prolong the war even further. Now, we'll talk about a little bit about nuclear leverage, but of course, Russia being the equivalent in its nuclear power to the United States, has leveraged threat of nuclear strikes I would say effectively. I think nuclear deterrence has held so far because NATO, while supplying Ukraine, has avoided any direct intervention. And of course, it has everything to do with the fact that nuclear deterrence applies. But another important consideration here is that as much as it may seem to us here that the international community support that it's sort of these are universal values, that there's kind of global support. But the truth is, though, that the so-called global South is not necessarily in line, or they don't necessarily share the same views on the war in Ukraine. They do perceive the West, NATO, and the United States in particular as being encroaching on Russia's and China's sphere of influence. So these anti-colonialism sentiments are still quite salient in global South. Now, on the Ukrainian side, Ukraine has good momentum right now. They are, morale is still high. They have relative manpower advantage. They also were able to mobilize the European partners and allies to where the Western unity, despite some disagreements in terms of kind of volumes and quality of capabilities provided, for the most part, I think one of the most amazing outcomes of the past year was precisely this level of Western unity. Now, I think one of the most remarkable events of this year was President Biden visiting Kiev, taking tremendous risks, making that trip, going into an active war zone by train where there are no American forces. American presidents have traveled to war zones before, but those were war zones where American military was under control. So this was a very important symbolic move, but also a strong signal to Putin that Ukraine is a different kind of ally now, that it's a different strategic relationship, and that the United States is committed to seeing this effort through, in one way or the other. So what are some of the lessons learned here? So one lesson that I would emphasize is that what the past year has shown us was Putin launching this criminal war. The war, this criminal war that Putin launched against Ukraine was not just a crime; it was a mistake. It was a miscalculation. It was fundamentally flawed in all of its premises, and it was a strategic blunder. But it was also what it showed us is that leaders who are in power for too long, who find themselves in a permissive environment with bad information, can lead to tragic outcomes. And I think that's one of the tragic lessons of this war is Putin's own kind of self-delusions and being in power for 22 years. I think we have seen that people's resilience and will to fight are decisive. And when the U.S., when they looked at military balance, Ukraine's equipment, manpower and equipment, of course, Ukraine seemed outmatched and outgunned, outmanned by far. But what the Ukrainians have shown is that something that's really hard to measure and predict is how is morale and motivation, but also how even a small motivated group of people, how much resistance they can put up against a better equipped opponent. Now, I think the thing that one of the key lessons for me in particular was the importance of strategic leadership. Zelensky really found himself in a historic moment where I think he is probably one of very few leaders right now in the world who has a clear strategy, who not only understands what he's trying to achieve, but he knows how to communicate it. I think what made Zelensky a great war leader is not only his ability to galvanize Ukrainians, but also his ability to communicate his vision to the rest of the world. He's traveled. Well, he came to the U.S. He hasn't traveled as much, but he spoke to every European country parliament, various communities, and his ability to galvanize the international, Western community at least, is truly remarkable. What we also found in last year is that the international system, the so-called rules-based order that Western countries built after World War II is flawed. The international system has failed to prevent or halt mass atrocities. I think the West was a little too slow to respond. We also have no mechanism to prosecute crime of aggression. And that's something that, that will be something that one of the many issues that Ukrainians will have to deal with is prosecuting war crimes and making sure that justice is rendered. But the international system has fundamentally failed Ukrainians, I believe. Now, what we also learned that Western solidarity, while imperfect, is quite strong. It's it is not something that it is not what Putin had counted on. In Putin's mind, the West was fractured, the European Union was weak. That one of his objectives here was to outweigh and outsuffer the West and show to his constituents and his audiences that democracies are flawed, that democracies are weak, democracies are too bogged down in elections, domestic politics, that they will eventually suffer from, Ukraine fatigue, from foreign wars. And I think what we saw was that values matter. That as cliche as some of those ideas may sound, but Western democracies really did rise to the occasion and found a new sense of unity around a similar value system. So values matter in political systems. We also saw that advanced technologies are helpful in wars, but only to an extent, will have limited effect. What the kind of war, the character of war that everybody predicted or anticipated was the involvement that involved the Russian military. Predicted that Russia would dominate in air. That's their way of fighting, that they would open up with massive airstrikes, which they failed to do. The Russians to this day continue to fail to achieve any air dominance. What we saw that we expected this to be primarily an artificial intelligence and cyber-driven warfare, and it's it's a war decided by tanks and artillery and airstrikes. So technology has not been, was not as decisive as a lot of people had predicted. But of course, American intelligence provided to Ukrainians in real time was absolutely a game changer. Quantity is quality. What we're finding now is that Europeans, Ukraine's supporters are running out of ammunition and missiles. Because our defense industrial base has not been calibrated for this type of war. So we're actually finding the United States is finding itself in a precarious situation by having to scale up production of sort of basic equipment and ammunition. But also what the war has shown us is that manpower, infantry, is relevant. Again, this is as much as the battles that are unraveling in the east of Ukraine right now are the defensive lines are held by humans, people, and these are human shields on both sides. And I think it's gruesome. It is tragic, but it's also what I think is a kind of a wake-up call for European militaries in terms of how to calibrate, their conscription policies or, future of warfare in general. And finally, the war, the past year has shown us that the current war effort, the most decisive element or what's going to turn the tide is who resupplies the front lines faster. So it's all about control of logistics, control of supply lines, And it's also why Ukraine is looking very seriously to target Crimea, because that's how Russia resupplies. So I'm just going to leave you on this note in the interest of time and see if you have any questions. But I just want to, by way of wrapping this up, so as a way of reflecting on the past year and kind of celebrating Ukraine's successes, but also learning from both, from Russian mistakes, but also from how slow the West was to respond. I think what we need to keep in mind going forward is not only how to help Ukrainians win the war, but also how do we help Ukraine win the peace. And that is not just about kind of resupplying Ukraine or providing humanitarian, financial, economic assistance to help Ukraine with the current war effort, but also help rebuild Ukraine, because Ukraine now is the front line really of Western democracy versus Russian autocracy. But it's also going to be facing the threat of the Russian aggression, even if there is, even if the lines freeze, even if at some point there's going to be some negotiated settlement. It doesn't mean that Russia will, in the foreseeable future, stop leveraging its military power against Ukraine. So Ukraine really needs to bolster its defenses in the long term, not just in the immediate future. We have also learned that a successful deterrent against Russia is also Europe's energy independence. That the reason Europeans were so slow to react to the impending Russian invasion, kind of leading in the beginning of last year, was because Russian energy firms and Europe's reliance on Russian energy were truly weaponized. That Russia has successfully leveraged its cheap energy against European political priorities. And I think that the Europeans now, Nord Stream 2, right before Russia invaded Ukraine, Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline that links Russia directly with Germany, was about to be launched, and against a lot of experts' advice. But we also need to plan for Russia's future. It's not a given that if that whoever succeeds Putin, that will necessarily be a more friendly regime. It's not a given that the war will end. So we really have to be paying attention to Russia's domestic politics. Again, we showed that authoritarians with bad information are dangerous. So I think that leaders around the world really need to be paying attention to how social media and internet is leveraged in support of authoritarian regimes. And I would just say, on the final note, that we really need to protect democracy at home. And this is kind of where, for me as an American Ukrainian, I think that kind of created a new sense of understanding and urgency as far as how we take our own institutions and democracy for granted here in the United States, and how easy it is to fracture that, and how easy it is for things to fall apart. Nobody in Ukraine knew. Ukrainians are, people like, they didn't expect a war to come to their homes, and nobody's immune from it. I think that what I'm trying to say here is that no matter how strong our democracy is, we're not immune from war. We're not immune from these systems fracturing. So we really need to be careful in how we treat our own institutions here at home to make sure that Western democracies remain strong and united around their values. So I'll close up on that, and looking forward to your questions.
Olena, thank you so much. I'm just going to dive right into the questions here. So the first one I'll post so everyone can read in full, but I'm going to summarize for the interest of time. But Peter has written some pieces in the Killingworth News and has texted and been astonished by kind of the resilience and the rallying of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian friends that he's texted, that kind of referencing what you've spoken to. And his question is, what is the possible end game? To me as an American, I'm like, give up a little bit of Donbass and Crimea to stop this. None of them even come close to agreeing with me. They think they'll fight forever until Russia quits, loses, etc. What do you see as a reasonable outcome?
That is $1 million question. So I mean, we're still, the war is still so dynamic and so contingent that unfortunately right now any outcome is as plausible as the next one. You know, we'll potentially, this could be a war of attrition to where you know, and it's looking like both Ukraine and Russia will keep fighting until they run out of ammunition, and they will seek a ceasefire, at least temporary ceasefire, to reconstitute their forces, resupply, reorient, you know, restructure their defensive and offensive lines. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, of course, if Ukraine goes after Crimea, which they're seriously talking about, mainly, I mean, obviously because it's sovereign Ukrainian territory, but also for very, you know, not simple, but very pragmatic, tactical military considerations, because Crimea is the main launching pad for Russia, and it's a military base, and it's also how Russia resupplies the front lines. So by going after, striking deeper into Crimea, the Ukrainians are going to try and attempt to cut the snake's head as opposed to, you know, chip away from the tail. And that's what a lot of American strategists have actually recommended that Ukraine should do. Now, if that transpires, if Ukraine actually begins a counteroffensive on Crimea, and Russia perceives it as threatening to its very existential survival, then it's not ruled out that Putin will resort to deploying a nuclear weapon, most likely a tactical nuclear weapon, to signal resolve to the West, to contain the West, to scare the West, and also to demoralize Ukrainians and to shield his own conventional forces. So we're, like I said, it's really hard to predict the outcome right now, the end game, because both Russia and Ukraine believe that this is winnable. They believe that they still have the momentum and they still have the upper hand, and defeat is unacceptable to Zelensky, nor is it acceptable to Putin. Realistically, we may see Putin scaling down his war aims, but he has not signaled that yet. So
thank you. We have a number of questions that are all in a similar vein, asking about whether or not you foresee China becoming involved or in some way supporting Russia.
Right, that is, I think, one of the most significant variables really is to see how China will choose to engage, because right now they're trying to maintain neutrality, but at the same time they haven't actively condemned the war. They do promote the narrative that this is the West's fault, that that the West has been too that the West has encroached on Russia's sphere of influence, so to speak. So I think China's role right now mainly kind of manifested itself in sustaining Russia economically, because both Russia and China India and China continue trading with Russia. India even more so, as they rely on Russian weaponry and cheap energy. So far, China has sustained the Russian economy, and that in and of itself has been obviously a factor and an impediment to the West's ability to degrade the Russian economy so that it wouldn't rebuild its military machine as quickly. But right now they're talking about actually providing, equipment and material support to Russia. If that transpires, I think it will prolong the war. However, I'm optimistic. I think that China is just trying to leverage that. They're trying to, extract concessions from the West, because it is not in the interest of China to prolong this war. As a matter of fact, China has stepped up multiple times, proposing themselves as a negotiator, as a peacemaker, because it's really going to hurt the Chinese economy and also regional security. The more as the war continues to affect the entire continent. So China is not interested in Russia's defeat. In China's interest, it would be best for this war to be contained, for the lines to be frozen, and in some ways to end, because it's really affecting stability in the region. And so that gives me hope that Russia will choose to play, that they will choose not to supply Russia with weapons to stabilize the region faster. But right now they're still trying to be neutral, but I think their participation is going to be decisive. So we should really be watching that closely.
Thank you. Sort of relatedly, a question about surprise that nations have seen colonial subjugation, like India and Africa, are seeming to side with Russia, which is trying to subjugate a colony. And do you have any thoughts on that dynamic? Granted, given that the other side, the West, were the colonial powers to some of these nations, is Russia not also sort of a colonial power?
Right, and that is precisely the narrative that Putin has been promoting. Is he knows that what resonates in the global South is anti-colonialism, presenting the West as a colonial power, as expanding its colonies and its proxies via NATO, moving military infrastructure to the Russian border. So Putin has chosen strategically. He's a strategic communicator, to emphasize colonialism or colonial politics of the West, to resonate or to appeal to galvanize the so-called global South. Now, the global South is mainly concerned with food prices and energy prices. They're not. I think what we see, and I'm looking at polling data that I skipped, where so the Open Society Foundation conducted a survey in September of last year where they asked this question: Russia is justified in wanting to have greater influence over Ukraine. And in the West, only 30% of people agreed. In the global South, 45% agreed. But in India, 56% said yes, Russia is justified in fighting against in maintaining its influence over Ukraine. So it's not a universal, again, there's no kind of universal buy-in to this, but I think Putin's choice of promoting this narrative that this is an anti-colonial war is intentional, because he is galvanizing. Somebody in his back in the fall of last year, when the 4 regions of Ukraine were illegally annexed, when Russia held the sham referenda there. And so Putin held a rally in support of kind of celebrating annexation of those territories, Ukrainian territories. I don't remember the number, but somebody one of my colleagues did a study on how many times Putin mentioned the word colonialism or any kind of derivative of that. And it was like about 100 times, something like that. So that was a prevailing narrative. And I think as flawed and sort of misguided that analogy is, I think it really does resonate in the South.
Yeah, and so a related question to this: are we/NATO really at fault for encroaching, in your opinion? Did that happen naturally? And then they've heard a phrase that NATO would not grow another inch during ending conversations during the Cold War, but realistically, is there blame there?
I think that's, again, that would be the narrative that Russia would want to see, that want to promote, that is NATO's fault. I also see that more of I don't see that as a decisive factor, honestly, because NATO has gone through multiple phases of expansion, and that did not trigger, in and of itself, that did not trigger a war, right, before. And I think the other thing too is that it's not as though Ukraine had any realistic prospect of joining NATO. You know, to this day, Ukraine's membership in NATO is a pretty unrealistic expectation, to be honest. And I think the Ukrainians have always been aware of that. So I think that, you know, blaming NATO for triggering Russia is a bit misguided, precisely because Ukraine had very little chance of joining NATO to begin with. You know, those concerns were a bit overemphasized and overstated. And I think that is precisely the narrative that the Kremlin had promoted in the West and also among their own audiences that has stuck, is that it is NATO's fault. I think it's not monocausal, right? I mean, it's not one reason. There is a combination of reasons. I think the most important factor that triggered Putin was Ukraine's democracy. It's the fact that Ukraine became an unpredictable democracy. It's the fact that Ukraine, that Russia considers its, its periphery historically, elected a leader in a democratic election who was very difficult to work with for Putin, who did not cooperate with Putin, and who was a very different kind of leader, who took a very significant anti-Russian turn and cooperated with the West. I think Russia was threatened by Ukraine's democracy. It was threatened by the fact that that Ukraine was aligning itself with the West. But I think it's more of an identity issue for Russia. It's losing Ukraine as a buffer. It's losing Ukraine as a kind of subordinate to Russia. It was not. This was not practical in nature as this was perceived as threatening, the Russian Empire, basically.
Right. Following, you're threading through other questions, which is really convenient for us right now. But it seems to me that national identity is a significant element of both the dialogue surrounding the war and the motivation of the parties to the war. And have we learned anything about how national identity acts as both sword and shield in international relations?
Absolutely. I think it's an excellent point. And it's a great question because, we're really seeing Ukraine's agency, the fact that Ukrainian people, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian society has agency. So they've sort of reaffirmed their agency in international affairs, that it's not just great powers that decide the outcomes. It's not just, military powers or nuclear powers that automatically have military advantage or political advantage. So I think that Ukraine not only reclaiming its own agency and national identity has not only been decisive and turned the tide of war in Ukraine, but I think it has been instructive to the rest of the world in terms of what a motivated group of individuals can achieve. That we cannot underestimate the rise of, or the value system that informs people's identity, that's centered on such ideas as nationhood and civil responsibility as opposed to ethnicity and language. So some of the more kind of primal character identity markers. So I really do think that the revival of, or the importance of nationality and nationhood is one of the most important externalities of this war that will be studied, or that have acquired a new sense of importance. That I can definitely see a lot of people going into this kind of research and looking at the importance of national identity and also cultivating national identity as an important instrument of power, if you will, because it can prove to be decisive.
Thank you. Another question, do you have a sense of the level of support / condemnation of this war from the Russian people?
Right. So the Russians really only started opposing the war when the mobilization started in September. So that was very interesting to see how the Russian society are not very politically active historically. That the way the regime is set up is to prevent people from participating in politics. The Russian media, independent media, has been banned. So the way Putin responded or alongside the war effort, Putin has also cracked down on, there's zero tolerance on dissent in Russia. Independent media has been cracked down on. Anybody who was able to leave has left. Obviously a lot of people have been jailed and are sanctioned. So the reason I don't really see much hope there for the Russians actually, protesting the war or somehow challenging Putin's regime is because, the change in public opinion. Well, first of all, it's really hard to gauge because it's dangerous to oppose the regime. But even among those who opposed the war, this was mostly in response to mobilization, not because the war is fundamentally wrong, right? So, and that's why I don't really see. So I think that's one thing that kind of failed, that we failed to see, that a lot of people expected to see, is that the war would somehow undermine Putin's regime. Well, what we have seen is that just because Putin has been losing the war doesn't mean that he has his control his political regime has been undermined or challenged, because the instruments of power he has available to them, the security services, obviously the coup-proofed regime. Putin has been coup-proofing his regime for 22 years. It's really, it's designed to resist any sort of public intervention. So, and I think all those characteristics really give a pretty grim view as to the Russians' ability to put any pressure on the Russian leadership. But I think the bottom line is that the opposition to war has not been as pronounced as we would expect it to be, and I think it will remain that way.
And I'm looking at the time. I want to be respectful of your time, and I have a very big question to close on. So when you say Russia has been breaking international law, why is that international courts or international organizations can't arrest Putin for these infringements on international law? Which laws or systems are lacking that would allow the arresting of leaders? Do we need new international organizations to enforce international law, or do we need to reform existing organizations to prosecute crimes of aggression?
Yes. So I was just say briefly, this is a big question, but so the elephant in the room here is crime of aggression. That we have the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that Russia is not a party to, Ukraine is not a party to, the US is not a party to. So the ICC does not have jurisdiction over prosecuting crime of aggression unless countries actually accept the ICC's jurisdiction. Now, Ukraine has accepted the ICC's jurisdiction, which allows ICC, the International Criminal Court, to investigate, document, and prosecute crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. So, the ICC has jurisdiction over 4 types of crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and crime of aggression. But because Russia is not party to the International Criminal Court, crime of aggression is the only crime that the International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over. And that's by design, and that's because the Western powers, when the Rome Statute was ratified, the Western powers, the UK, the United States, France, actually insisted that an exception is made to where the ICC would not be given jurisdiction over crime of aggression, because crime of aggression is a leadership crime. Crime of aggression allows the ICC to prosecute, it establishes command responsibility over war crimes, so to where it's the political leadership that can be targeted. And of course, no great power wanted their political leadership to be targeted and create a precedent. So there is a flaw, there is a gap in the international justice system that does not allow for universal prosecution of leaders that initiate, that give orders and that are complicit in the crime of aggression itself, that makes all other crimes possible. Yes, I mean, like I said, the Ukrainian judicial system, there's several dozen investigative teams right now in Ukraine, meticulously documenting war crimes. So there's various, OSCE has a team, ICC has a team, various European countries have their own teams, forensic investigators, making sure that collection of evidence is impartial and systemic. But again, there are all these mechanisms to prosecute people who committed those crimes on the territory of Ukraine, but we don't have a process to actually hold the leaders in the Kremlin responsible. And that, I think, makes our system quite weak in not just punishing for crime of aggression, but also deterring crime of aggression. So it's not a given that, well, first of all, we don't know if we hope that a special tribunal will be created outside ICC, kind of the way Yugoslavia war crimes were prosecuted, Rwanda, and so on and so forth. So there is precedent for establishing special tribunals to prosecute war crimes in these specific situations. I think it will take time. It will take a lot of obviously political will, but it's unfortunate because time is of the essence. Witnesses die. It's still an active war zone. Witnesses get killed, and there is a sense of urgency to this. But again, what I think, on a hopeful note, what I would end on is, I think that as much as the war in Ukraine revealed all these flaws in the international judicial system that not only fail to punish for crimes of aggression, but also fail to prevent. But it's also an opportunity. I see this as an opportunity for the West, for the global community, to really make some significant changes. It will cost a lot of political will be required, but I think that this is an opportunity to really revise the existing laws and structures and mechanisms, and finally mobilize enough support in the United Nations to actually create a universal mechanism for making crime of aggression illegal across the board. And I think this is an opportunity that hopefully will result in some positive. I'm optimistic. I think that as tragic as the war has been, I know that Ukraine will win. I don't know at what cost, but Russia has already strategically lost. And I hope that the international community, so to speak, will also revise rules, international laws, and international judicial system to prevent such such crimes from happening, and most importantly, for political leaders from getting away with impunity.
Oh yeah, thank you.
That somber note.
I know, but I want to reiterate too, there's so many people in the questions who have given thanks to you and expressed, resilience for the Ukrainian people. And I also want to thank our library partners for helping to promote this, Groton Public, Stonington Free, and Otis. And I wanted to thank you again, Olena, because you really managed to pack so much, a huge, broad view, and yet a chronology of events and a narrative that keep us all in the know. And we're really appreciative for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for coming. Please stay tuned. And I appreciate your support. And, if you can, I would encourage you to continue educating other people. I think that's the least we could do, because bad information, I think, if there's anything we learn from that's relevant to us, here in the United States, as safe as we may be, is that powerful people with bad information are very dangerous, and it is upon us to prevent it from happening.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
For that. Last question. Do you have future talks or ways that people could sort of keep in touch or watch other lectures you might have in the coming weeks or months?
Well, thank you for giving me an opportunity to promote my Twitter. I almost forgot to say, but follow me on Twitter. But I always do. Thank you for asking that. I'm on Twitter. I try to engage as much as possible. So it's simple, at Olena Lennon, which is my first and last name. I post announcements on there. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook because that's where Ukraine is. Ukrainians love Facebook. So I'm also on Facebook. But you can also email me. My email is on the University of New Haven website. I'm public. I welcome people to. Yeah, thank you so much. Again, and Ari, thank you so much for organizing this. I'm just happy that we have this platform available to us to connect and that paying attention. Yeah,
likewise. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.